Ruth, I wonder where you're going to bounce with this.
Oh, goodness me. I mean, so first of all, thank you, Kathy, and thank you, Richard, for what you've brought. And Kathy, listening to you reminded me of a conversation we had maybe a week ago, maybe less than a week ago, when I was in Aranda country with Dr. Kathleen Wallace, who introduced us to a painting that she had made. So an Aranda woman who is not well at the moment, but we were lucky enough to meet with her, and she's an artist and a theologian. Do people know of her, Kathleen Wallace? She's somebody to look out for. Recently made a doctor of the university up there, and anyway, she had painted an image of the Virgin Mary with Jesus. It's called the Sacred Heart of Jesus, and it has an image of Mary with her hand on the breast of the grown child Jesus holding his heart. So it's a symbolic but very real image. And the figures of Mary and Jesus are painted as Aranda people in full ceremonial paint. And she had around the top there were three large circles, and she has a beautiful description of this painting, which, as I said, is now the main stained glass window in the Roman Catholic Church in Alice Springs. And she told the story of the Trinity within her culture, but as it had been told pre-Christian times. And I was struck by her generosity in sharing that story with us, and then in us being asked to consider the notion of the Trinity and of creation within our cultures. And she propelled me back beyond the Christian era through the lens of my land, where when the first Christians came to Scotland, they met the Picts and the Druids and other ancient peoples who were carrying a culture and stories from that land. And I guess I've been realizing all the way through this pilgrimage how much I take for granted all of those stories, and how precious they are, and how much more fully I should learn to understand them and live through them. So to Kathleen Wallace, and to you, Kathy, and to all others who have taught us so much from your experiences, I pay my respects and offer my huge gratitude. I think the thread I wanted to pick up, Kath, back to your question really, is the one that's really compelling me right now. What does all this have to do and to say to us now as we look out onto our world, where the climate is in turmoil, and biodiversity loss, certainly in my part of the world, is massive. The number of birds that are audible here is striking. We're losing our birds in our part of the world. They are becoming extinct. A recent report, Scotland's Nature Watch, catalogued the extent of the recent biodiversity loss in our culture. And so I'm left with the compelling question, what do we do as people of faith now, drawing on our culture, on the riches of our authentic cultures, and looking forward to those cultures which we will pass on to our future generations. One of my great gurus is a guy called John Paul Lederach, who is a Mennonite from the USA, and he writes a lot about mediation and reconciliation, and he writes out of his faith, but he would be the first to say, and he has said, he's not a theologian, but my goodness, he writes from a place of deep faith. And he need for us to have a moral imagination, that to move into this next phase of our lives, we need the cultural, spiritual, economic, geographical imagination to think beyond what's currently here. And that is a really compelling invitation. And he talks about the art of the moral imagination. What are the key pillars that we need? And one of those is that a paradoxical curiosity is what he says. To imagine that the grandchildren of my enemies will be the friends of my grandchildren. It doesn't take a lot to get to that place, but when I think of that invitation, I want to make the world a place where my perceived other, the people with whom I am not on the same trajectory, nevertheless, we are all human beings, and our grandchildren will one day be friends. And goodness me, being here, particularly in Gippsland, and hearing a little bit of the story of the violence and the horrors, particularly yesterday when we were with Rob in the keeping place. If I think back to that question and the friendships between my great-grandparents' children and my great-grandparents and your great-grandparents, I can only weep with the sorrow. And yet here we are now. What is ours now to do? To find a way to make this world a place where our grandchildren will be friends. And more than friends, will be the ambassadors. So again, part of the answer is in the choices we make on an everyday basis. And I have been so struck by the commitment to recycling and to low carbon lives in many parts of Australia. I'm also struck by the paradox that to travel around this vast continent, we rely on oil and gas. And we've struggled with the flying that's been involved in our trip. And I know many members of my community have struggled with that. Do we really need to fly? I know that question lands differently here. It's not an easy question, but coming from a continent where we have very good public transport, we don't really need to fly anymore within Europe, really at all. But what does that feel like here? I don't know. I'm looking to you for some of those answers. And then my last thing about where next. For me, it's to do with community. It's to do with finding our allies, our tribe, our mob, our friends with whom we share a faith journey and can talk deeply and honestly about the things that are really difficult. So choices around carbon consumption. And certainly from my perspective in my country, the addiction to carbon and the blind addiction, we don't realise we're overusing carbon. Looking for places where we can talk honestly about the difficult choices we make on a daily basis, what we do with our time, what we do with our money, what we do with the Earth's resources, how we live well with Earth. These are some of the big questions that we need to be asking. And that's why I belong to a Christian community. As a Quaker, as a Presbyterian, and as a member of the Iona community, I know that I'm around people with whom I can have those difficult conversations.